Libros Schmibros is a podcast exploring the people, books, movies, and ideas that Angelinos care about in a thoughtful way that even New Yorkers can understand. We're coming to you from Libros Schmibros, our nonprofit bilingual lending library in Boyle Heights, on the west coast of the country and the east bank of the mighty Los Angeles River.
I'm David Kipen. I am among teaching at UCLA and editorializing on behalf of a new federal writers project. I am the founder of Libros Schmibros, which I dare say you may not know, Mr. West, is a nonprofit storefront bilingual lending library in Boyle Heights, across the street from the Mariachi Plaza station.
Well, I know of it generally through you, and I want to find out more about it, and I will go exploring myself at some point.
I would dearly love that. I guess, well, let me ask by asking you about your backdrop. It's beautiful.
Oh, that's we're sitting in my living room because I have been working at home, as you can imagine, for the past 14 months practically. Yeah, although I can go back to the office now, and I do. But no, we're sitting in my living room, and it's a painting by a favorite contemporary native artist of mine, Tony Abeta. And I hasten to emphasize, as a director, that I acquired it before I was in the director's position, so there is no conflict.
I perfectly understand. As a director myself, I have to mind my P's and Q's.
Yes.
I guess I left out the most important thing, which is that Libros Schmibros has this podcast, and you've been gracious enough to agree to it, and so I'll try to make it as painless as possible. Let me think for a moment. I gather you've announced that you're retiring as early as next month, but I understand you also retired once before. So why should we believe you?
Well, there are a couple of things going on there. First of all, because my successor, whom I know very well, is one of your colleagues at UCLA, the former chair of the American History Department, Steve Aaron. Because of academic schedules, he had to let people know much sooner than I would have had to let people know I was leaving, that he was coming. And so I actually announced last September that I was leaving. So even though June 30th is coming up in a rush, we've known a long time that this was going to happen. And on the question about retirement, go ahead.
I realize as a mark of my podcasting professionalism, I haven't introduced you.
Oh, well, okay.
And perhaps in view of my rustiness, I should give you the opportunity to do it.
Surely, I'll be glad to do that. Then we'll come back to retirement. My name is Rick West, and I'm currently the president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West here in Los Angeles. And come June 30th, I will become the president and CEO emeritus, ambassador, Native Communities. That's my title in retirement at the Autry. I also am the founding director and director emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, where I was for some 20 years. Now, so on to the retirement question. Here's how it works. Basically, when my wife, Mary Beth, to whom I've been married come June 29th, about 53 years, said, well, we went through this hoop once. This time, I expect it to stick, and it had better stick. So with that motivation, I am indeed retiring on June 30th. And while I don't intend to be completely quiescent in retirement, I will indeed not have an 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. job 6 days a week any longer. And for that, I am indeed grateful, because I'll have an opportunity to do some other things too. So it will stick, I promise you, David.
I don't do it on my account. You mentioned your very long and durable marriage, which makes me wonder, as I was wondering already, how did your parents meet?
How did my parents meet? Well, my dad, Dick West, is the native side of my family. We're Cheyenne from Oklahoma. And my mother was non-native, and they met at a small junior college which had been a former Indian mission school in Oklahoma called Bacone College. Now, because he had spent the first 20 years of his life in boarding schools, he went to college late. And so my mother was actually on the faculty. He was a student as a 20-something. And they were quite proper, and they didn't date while he was a student and she was a faculty member. But then when he went on to University of Oklahoma to finish up college, they indeed ended up getting married after a couple of years. And so that's how they met. And it's an interesting combination, which is sort of reflective of my life in certain respects. He's Native, she wasn't. Not only was she not Native, but she was the daughter of missionaries to China. And so the irony of that was not lost upon me looking back at it in retrospect, when my mother not only countenanced the brown people, she married one of them, and they also had a lovely and lasting marriage. But that's how they met, was at Bacone College back in the late 30s.
It makes me want to ask, my wife is writing a book now partly about her Ojibwa roots. And this is Colleen Giretti, who also teaches with me at UCLA. And it makes me very curious, how would you say that growing up part Native American would have been different from someone whose parents are Native American on both sides?
Well, I think it may have been more distinctive then than it is now. For me, it sits in the backdrop of this particular history. I was born, believe it or not, in San Bernardino, about 60 miles from here. And the reason I was born in San Bernardino is that during World War II, Dad was stationed in the Navy in California. And it also happened that my mom's family was settled here in Southern California. So hence his being out here, my being out there. But then by design, we returned very promptly toward Oklahoma soon after World War II. And so the setting we were in was essentially more Native than non-Native. In other words, we were back in Oklahoma amongst our friends and relatives from Cheyenne country, which is in Western Oklahoma, even though Bacone is in Eastern Oklahoma. And the college where I was raised was, at the time I was there, probably about 90% Native in student body. And so it was very much a Native surround. Was I aware that I was a half-breed? Well, yes, because I look like one. My brother does not. My brother looks much more Native than I do. Although those who are Native can usually pick me out for being Native. We won't go into exactly how, but they can. So it was never an issue as I was growing up. There was more sensitivity then, I believe, to those who were not full bloods than there is now, simply because the blood has become increasingly diluted as we go forward. In my tribe, for example, the CNAs in Oklahoma are now considering reducing the blood quantum requirement to 1/8 instead of 1/4. And so it's possible that, our kids actually will have the opportunity to enroll too, which I would like, because they have both sat quite close to the Native community and to Cheyenne country in Oklahoma.
What does that proposed change from 1/4 to 1/8 reflect?
I think it reflects the fact that there is blood dilution, if you will, and the fact that was not our doing. Blood quantums are really an instrument of colonialism, if you will. In other words, they were established by the Department of the Interior, not by the Cheyennes. Even though the Cheyenne, they just want to make sure that they don't lose community, simply because those who do have cultural connections with the tribe do not have the ability to actually be formally a part of the community and be a citizen, if you will, of Cheyenne-Arapaho.
Got it. And I gather you came back to California for your college years, is that right?
I did, and that was really because my mother went to the University of Redlands, and I went to the University of Redlands, and my brother went to the University of Redlands. So it was, I would never say this because I have great respect for the university on whose board I have sat from time to time. It was slight default, if you will. In other words, college counseling at Muskogee Central High in Oklahoma was not at the apex of such things. And it was, I have no regrets for having gone there. I loved it. And I'm not sure I could have taken much more at the time, quite honestly. Still, coming to LA from Muskogee, Oklahoma was like going to the moon, quite frankly.
What was that like? What do you remember about it?
Well, what I remember about it, I guess the first time I came by train. Yeah, not by plane, but I came by train, I think. And then you had to go up to Kansas City and then come out on what had been Santa Fe, you know, through New Mexico and Arizona. And I remember coming to an area that was clearly urban, except, you know, that was San Bernardino. And then we went on for another hour and we were still in the city. And I remember thinking, what on earth? And then LA, in contrast to now, LA was just, I mean, it still is a mega city, I know that, but it has now kind of centers of community. We live in Los Feliz. That really very much has its own feel and everything to it. And LA at that time just had no center. That's what troubled me. It was just this expansive urbanity with no centers to it. And therefore, in my view, not much community to it. So it was kind of startling in that way. But then I sort of compounded things by going from LA to Boston to grad school. And that was again like going to the moon, but a different moon.
Well, I promise I'm not going to frog march you through your entire life, but I'm curious. I've been working quite hard this year trying to reinvent the Federal Writers Project.
Yes, I saw it.
And I've come into contact with a guy named Jim Fallows, who also went to Redlands. It must be a remarkable place.
I have, you know, it was, as I say, in some respects, it's about all I could take at that time with all the changes. But I loved it. You know, I'm deeply supportive of small, good liberal arts colleges because there's just a humanity and manageable empathy to them that was very important to me, being so startled by having left Oklahoma. So it worked out very well.
Even before you got to Redlands, were you a bookish kid?
Yes, I was a debater and a bookish kid. They kind of went together.
Were there, I mean, I say this selfishly because, you know, part of what we do at Libros is try to turn younger people onto reading if they haven't found it on their own, of course. Were there early books that got to you and made a reader out of you?
Probably so. I remember, yes, there were probably several. Some of them we had to read, you know, in English class in high school, but others we didn't that I liked. I remember Zorba the Greek. Now that may have not been when I was, I don't know, when did Zorba the Greek get published?
Well, the movie was in the 60s, I assume.
Right, and the book must have been. In any event, that was books that stood out for me were those that had sort of an existential edge to them. Zorba the Greek did, and Camus. To the extent that I could wade through that, which was super existential. But the books that stand out for me, honestly, are those which have to do, I don't want to make this sound too grand, but with the nature of man and the nature of the universe, if you will. And especially when I was trying to find my way at the time out of the Baptist church. So it all fit together in some ways. And not that I completely left the church.
Were you exposed to much Native American literature as a kid?
No, because it didn't exist for the most part. Seriously, it did not exist.
What was your first encounter with it? When did that come?
My first encounter with it is oral, not read. And that shouldn't surprise you because our tradition is oral.
Yeah.
And so my first encounter with what I would call literature, even though orally expressed rather than in writing, was I have a recollection when I was 6 years old of being at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, where my father was getting his Master of Fine Arts. And each night, and this was kind of before air conditioning, it was hot as all get out, humid, uncomfortable, terrible. And he would tell us legends. And one time, the houses were also very close together, and our neighbor heard my father telling these stories to us. And so she proposed to him the idea. And so this is also one of the first books that I read, called Tales of the Cheyenne, which my father illustrated for her. And she happened to work for the University of Oklahoma Press. So that's how all of that got put together rather quickly. So, you know, it's an interesting question you ask, because at that time, authors, native authors, it was storytelling, but it was storytelling in oral form, not necessarily printed form. It is only sort of, I would say, with probably into the 70s and late 70s, 80s, that there began to be a raft of very good people who wrote. And I remember being absolutely mesmerized because his father, Al Momaday, had been a colleague of my father's.
You're speaking of Scott Momaday and the way. Yeah.
And so they had something which had a very ambitious title. It was called The Convocation of American Indian Scholars. And I was a struggling first-year student in law school at Stanford. I would not really consider myself entitled to be in a convocation of American Indian scholars, but I was there nonetheless. And this is just as Housemaid of Dawn was coming out.
Yeah.
So he read it to us. He gave a reading for us who were attending the conference, and it was transformative.
Really?
So I was convinced that what I had always heard through my ears, I could also experience through my eyes by reading it too, because it was a profoundly beautiful book.
And people don't think of it as a Los Angeles novel, but of course, part of it is about the protagonist's time in LA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And because he was a BIA kid, he kind of moved around with, with his parents when they were going from one spot to another. But he is, to this day, I can promise you, deeply, deeply Kiowa. And I see him from time to time still.
Now, when you speak of Native American literature, whether oral or written, it sounds as if you're speaking of that literature in English.
Yes, I am.
And, partly, because I'm working on this writers project plan, I think I find myself thinking of native language preservation, which the original writers project was part of. Are we as much in danger of losing languages these days, and especially in light of the pandemic, as I've heard? I've been friends for decades with Malcolm Margolin, who of course has done so much with News from Native California.
It's funny you should be that. I was on a Zoom with him day before yesterday.
How is
he? I know him very well.
Oh, I bet.
He's been one of my longtime heroes. He's one of the very best white men I know. And just a wonderful human being. And we were doing a memoriam, and we'll come back to what you were talking about.
Yes.
But we were doing a memoriam for the former chairman of our board, the person who recruited me to come to the Autry, and named Marshall McKay, who's a very distinguished Native leader and former president of Yochadihi up north in California, the community. And he passed because of COVID. And so we were doing that. But Malcolm and I worked together. He was in, taking the lead and doing most of it, but we collaborated on trying to do that. So anyway, back to your question. Yeah, it is language is in danger. There's no question about it. And one of the things that I want to do in retirement, I do not speak fluent Cheyenne.
Right.
I know some Cheyenne. My father understood a fair amount of Cheyenne, but of course, when he was growing up, he was put in boarding schools when he was 4 or 5 years old, and stayed there until he was in his early 20s. And of course, it is not just legend. They were literally throttled for speaking Cheyenne in the classroom. And so the language kind of went in that respect, as the federal policy wanted it to go at that point. And so we've been recovering from that ever since. And one of the things that I do wish to do in retirement is we are establishing, it may already exist on paper, but it needs to be kind of revived and rejuvenated. The Cheyenne, maybe Cheyenne and Arapaho, but it's certainly a Cheyenne Historical Society that sort of sits in Western Oklahoma. And one of the projects there, excuse me, will be the preservation of language, which is incredibly important. But there's an interesting twist to your asking about that, because you must be familiar with Troyer at USC.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
David Troyer, the novelist.
And he has rather specific views about those. I'm not even sure I agree with him completely, but he writes so beautifully, I can't resist it. That those who sort of purport to be telling native stories, who write in English, and it sort of begins and ends with English. The story begins in English in their minds and ends with English on paper in the book. There's something missing with that. And so he, as you know, has gone to great pains, and I think that he is reasonably fluent at this point in Ojibwe, and which is his community. And he feels that there's a great deal to be attached to being able to speak the language and to even write in the language, if you will. But at least to have it be a critical piece of doing the storytelling, because there's so many things which sort of get lost in translation, to invoke the movie for a moment.
Right. I don't know if any efforts have been made in the other direction. If literature, like for example, Housemaid of Dawn, or any classics, are beginning to be translated into native languages like Cheyenne or Kiowa. Do you know?
I would doubt that, quite honestly. I don't want to say no. I'd love it if I were proved to be wrong that is happening now. I do know that Housemaid of Dawn has been translated into French, but that's a far cry from Kiowa. And part of it is that since the languages, with the exception of the Cherokee Cyrillic alphabet, are phonetic. In other words, the only way you can preserve them in writing is phonetic, and there are just not enough people who speak it, really. And I think that's unfortunate. I hope it will change.
I guess I have another selfish question, which is, I had a book out a few years ago called Dear Los Angeles, the City in Diaries and Letters. And I'm now writing Dear California, the State in Diaries and Letters. And there's a problem with the original that I'd like to redress, which is it starts in 1542 with the Cabrillo expedition. I would love somehow, if not with a diary or a letter, I would like to start as far back as that, if not before, with native speakers from, certainly before the 16th century. Is there any oral history, or better yet, creation myth, or what do I know about this? You know better than I do. Where would you look for such a thing?
Well, where I will look, again, you have ready access at UCLA. Just trot yourself right over to the American Indian Studies Department. And of course, the Autry itself has a very close association, in fact, a formalized agreement with them at the moment. Which has been put in place since I got here, and I hope it will last forever, with the Tongva, who are the Gabrielino Tongva, are sort of the originating group of this whole basin, really. Along with the Chumash. I want to be very careful because the Chumash have some territory that's in LA County too. But there are folks there, and Steve Aaron actually is supervising, if I'm not mistaken, the dissertations of one of the students who is Tongva, is a distinguished anthroarchaeologist scholar. But that's where you turn. I mean, and we will be doing something at the Autry eventually that is much more explicitly and physically a recognition of Tongva, of the fact that we sit on Tongva land, and we acknowledge it every time we have a program at the Autry, quite honestly. We should.
One of the things that we're working on is potentially, we would hope that the Writers Project pays some attention to the Paiute in Mono County. So as we're talking about all these communities in California, how would you say that California Native Americans might or might not be in some way different or distinct from Native populations elsewhere in the country?
Well, what I would say, there are a couple of things I would say. Of Native populations in North America, or in the United States even, the most populous regions were in California. And you can understand why. An abundance of natural resources, mild climates, surplus economies, et cetera, all were there. And unfortunately, the flip side of that coin is, even as among Native people, honestly, and we Cheyennes did not do so terribly well by the 7th Cavalry either, but even in comparison, Native peoples and communities in California were decimated in some ways, far worse than any other set of Native communities in the United States. And they have been a long time trying to recover from that. I know when we were doing the consultations for the NMAI, which we did for a 2 to 3 year period before we designed any buildings or put programs together, California was first on the consultation list. And I did that very specifically and intentionally because they have felt left out sometimes of even their own larger Native community.
Really?
And it's just a series of awful things. I mean, the gold rush came along when it did. And just as that came along, there was a whole raft of treaties that were to have been approved during that period, which would have made them all federally recognized. Instead, it didn't happen. And so they've been scrapping ever since, trying to figure out how to get federal recognition that they probably should have had over 100 years ago, and didn't get 150 years ago. And they just had a lot of uphill. The demographic collapse of Native communities in California was just dramatic. In approximately a decade and a half period, the demographic collapse was almost 75%. And that was because of literally of bounties that were issued by the territorial government with respect to natives in California. It was dreadful.
I know there's a scholar a couple of years ago, is it Benjamin Madley, who wrote a book called American Genocide? Is American Genocide sound like a fitting title to you?
Absolutely. I don't know how you can call it anything else. He actually, when the book came out, we held a book signing, a lecture and a book signing at the Autry for it, and it you can tell it has in that kind of setting the power of basically being an accounts book. I think it's a dissertation probably made into a book.
Yeah, but
it is nothing but the facts, and you just look at it, and it's like getting a brickbat right in the face. It is undeniable. You just can't skirt it. So the numbers speak tons.
Now, I know you were a history major, at least at Redlands and maybe at Harvard. Is this a part of history that you studied, or did you specialize in something else?
No, I was a history major at Redlands, and I was in the American History department at Harvard. at the time, because there was no option, my pursuit, both a little bit at Redlands as well as at Harvard, was diplomatic history, U.S. diplomatic history. And the diplomatic historian, I don't know, you're too young to remember all these people, but Ernie May was the diplomatic historian at Harvard, who was just stunning. And so I was delighted to do that. But then I found out when I got there that Oscar Hanlon's view of American history was a little bit like this for me. If I wanted to know anything more there about Native history. I mean, it just wasn't an object of scholarship for the most part at that time. It is now, very much so, but it wasn't then. And that's one of the reasons why I bailed. I was in a PhD program in history. And then I decided after about 3 months of that I should have gone to law school after all. And then that's when I decided to go to law school, and I went to Stanford. I wanted to be near the, if you will, near the barricades in the mid-60s, that I could be becoming an academic in history from Harvard.
And California, I dare say, was a good place to be near the barricades.
It was, although I was Stanford, not Berkeley. If you really wanted to be near the barricade, you went slightly to the northeast and crossed the bay and went to Berkeley.
Well, let's actually leap over your legal career, and because I want to know what it's like to start a museum from scratch.
Do you see all the gray hair? From that. No, I loved it. I loved it. And starting from scratch, it is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you're writing on pretty much a clean slate. Although if you're a Smithsonian Museum, it's not absolutely clean because you're in this big established institution, but it was about as clean as one could have hoped in that situation. So that's the blessing. And then the curse is that every mistake you make is your own. It's nobody else's. Yeah. And I think that what, and this is in retrospect, I won't claim wisdom at the time, but in retrospect, I would say that what appeals to me, I've never been anything but a museum director in the field. In other words, I didn't work my way up through the curatorial ranks or anything like that. I was a director from the beginning. Thought I knew much more than I really knew, and I paid some pence for that. But what appealed to me about it is that it is, for those of us, however good we are at it, who have an entrepreneurial bent, it is wonderful territory to be in. And remember that even the secretary of the Smithsonian, who's a very distinguished and established anthropologist, Bob Adams, was much of the mind that this was a different place, that there was something about that institution that made Native peoples not just audiences of the National Museum of the American Indian, but constituents of the National Museum of the American Indian, and that there was a lot of self-definition and first-person voice that went along with that, as well as the special responsibility to Native communities and bringing the NMAI to them and not expecting them to trundle to either Washington, D.C. or New York to participate. And that was very much of appeal to me. I mean, I had a solid enough background having grown up Native. I even had a certain connection with museums because Dad was a very successful artist. His art is in all of those museums at this point. And so I had that kind of connection. And so I arrived with certain ideas. I was not a completely blank slate when I got there. And the three fundamental prongs of the mission statement of the NMAI at the beginning were what were in my mind. And it was first-person voice. It was Native peoples as on a large, extensive time continuum from a very deep past right up to the present. No ethnographic remnants here. Nobody falling off the stage of history. We're right here. And then finally, that we had a responsibility to give back or associate with in very collaborative and profound ways with living Native communities. And those were the three things that the institution went after during my tenure as director.
And when you say first person, you mean, and here again we go back to the Writers Project, you mean reliant to a great degree on oral history, or what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean native viewpoint.
Oh,
And it could be oral history, but it could be contemporary observation, which is contemporary history,
yeah.
if you will. But the idea being that native people were capable and knowledgeable about their history, their experience, and even the present and projecting to the future, and that it should be accorded authority and authenticity. Instead of constantly having our history and experience told in a third-person voice. Now, it was not a new exclusivity. It's not that I wanted to get rid of that. It's that I wanted more inclusion. It's not that I wanted exclusivity for native first-person voice, but I really did feel that it should be an authoritative part of the interpretive and representational mix at the NMAI.
Well, I mean, as someone who spent 5 years in Washington, from 2005 to 10 as director of literature at the NEA, I'm here to say that you succeeded amazingly well. I have no native background, but I went several times and found it thrilling. Do you go back? Do you go back to see how it's kept faith with your original vision?
No, I do. What the native world is very small in lots of ways. It so happens that the current director, Kevin Gover, is my former law partner. So I mean, how can you get any more incestuous than that? And no, he's very much kept the dream alive, and so no, I honestly, if you're a founding director, you do a great kindness by simply vanishing for a while. Founding directors tend not to do that easily. I think I did reasonably well at doing that, but they tend to hang on, and they stick around and intermeddle when they shouldn't be doing that, and all of that kind of thing. And so I wanted sort of a clean break that way. But I'm over a decade out of that position now, and so I do go back, and I love going back. I love being in the place. I really do. That building on the mall is very special to me.
Oh, my last word remains congratulations. It's tremendous. Now, I guess you were in less danger than most directors, especially founding directors who leave, because you had a new institution before long. You weren't starting a museum, but you were, I don't know, restarting a museum at the Autry?
Well, that was the idea. The idea was that I knew the Autry very well, partly through my association earlier with the Autry when the Southwest Museum of the American Indian had been merged into the Autry. And at that time, John Gray, and we kidded each other about just switching chairs. I came to the Autry as his not immediate successor, but one of his successors. And he went to the Smithsonian as the director of the National Museum of American History. And we just sort of changed seats around. But it was, so I had a connection. I had a connection here to begin with. But there is an intellectual and a museological point about the Autry as compared even to the NMAI, which is of great interest to me. And that was the reason that I finally did it. The NMAI, in a couple of sentences, grew up out of the multicultural movement of the late 80s and early 90s in the United States, as those communities of culture that had been marginalized kind of banged on the door of the middle to get back into the narrative. And in museums, that took the form of multicultural or ethnic specific museums, which the NMAI unquestionably was in that way. But I'm reminded of what Lonnie has said, Lonnie Bunch who used to sit on the NMAI board when he was working on the African American Museum, and saying, this is not a museum of African American history. This is a museum of American history. Yeah. And in a way, those of us who were ethnic specific by origins and directorships, I think went through that. I certainly did. Went through that transformation even when I was at the NMAI. And so what the distinction is between NMAI, which at least in its origins is a multicultural institution for all the right reasons, Native voice, being a gathering place for Native peoples themselves, etc., to the Autry, which I would describe as intercultural, not multicultural. In other words, multicultural museums tend to be a series of verticals, if you will, they can be. Intercultural implies a horizontal, if you will, interconnectivity. However it may be conflicting, it may be harmonious, often it isn't, blah, 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 blah. But it's a much more complete take, if you will, and nuanced and subtle take on history and culture. And that's what intrigued me about the Autry. And I think it does do that. They did it under John Gray, and it's doing it still.
Now, as I say, I adore the National Museum of the American Indian, and then I came back home to California, which is my birthplace as well, and I fell under the spell of the Autry. I launched a book there, and I do all my holiday shopping in the gift shop.
Don't stop.
You have, or the Autry has, I don't know if I can speak of you interchangeably for much longer, the Californiana and the Los Angeles shelf within that at the Autry gift shop is the rival of any bookshop I know.
I'm delighted to hear that. And I think you will find that even more so. And I would never put words in Steve Aaron's mouth. He speaks so well himself. But what I will say is that I have always considered the Autry. I came wanting to make sure that in the museum community, and even in this city, that the Autry had the kind of footprint that it should have. It's a very distinguished institution.
Yeah.
It has been doing good work for a very long time that, interestingly enough, is often more recognized outside of the city than inside the city. And I wanted to change that. I think we've made some progress in doing that. And one of the reasons is if there's any museum in town that is really kind of a city museum of this city in terms of the expanse of its collections, which cut across everything, all communities, all kinds of collecting, historical material, archaeological, anthropological, art, etc. The Autry has it. I mean, on a per square foot basis, it has a huge collection. It is over 600,000 objects that sit in that institution, and that's large for a museum of the Autry size. And I just wanted to make our footprint more firm in exactly what we are in this intercultural approach to interpretation. I think Steve has signaled, and you can ask him about this sometime. Steve has signaled that he wants the Autry to be even more so in that way. Even he wants to enhance the connectedness of the Autry with the diverse audiences and communities in LA, because he recognizes, which I do. I think I told you in one of our exchanges that we intend to stay here in LA. It's practical because our whole family is here now, kids, grandkids, etc. But it's also just because there's a sheer, for me, inspiring muscularity to LA as an arts and culture and museum city. There really is. You know, San Francisco can sniff all it wants.
Yeah.
But honestly, there's no comparison between the two cities in these terms. We are far more the city of the future. We sit on the West Coast looking west into the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think it's a fascinating place to be. And so I think it would be a great development if somehow the connections between the Autry and LA and our connection, as you defined it, through the bookshelf, kind of expands even more, if you will, in having a connectedness with the city that's important.
Well, probably you know, but our listeners may well not. There's recently been a committee that
released a report about civic memory in Los Angeles, about how we commemorate the history, the good and the bad over the years. And there's even sort of shoehorned into it at one point the possibility that there might be what a lot of us have daydreamed about. There might be a museum of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to take you at your word about how, you corrected your last museum, but just hypothetically, if you were going to help create a museum of Los Angeles, or if you were going to whisper in the ear of somebody who wanted to create such a museum, what would your recommendations be?
Well, it should be very much, this is partly just my museology speaking, if you will, but it should be very much as Secretary Adams said, some of the first words out of his mouth were that the NMAI was going to be an outside-in, bottoms-up museum. Forget the temple on the hill.
Yeah.
Forget the self-appointed priesthood, etc. And somehow I think that for an institution like that to succeed in Los Angeles, you would have to look at it that way. It would need very much to be a bottoms-up, outside-in kind of institution that had not sort of formalized and correct community connection, but sort of a working on a daily basis connection with the community and what is going on here. Believe me, in terms of history, the ties of that to present issues, etc., it's just unbelievable what sits in this city. So I would say that as an approach, it would have to be organized in a way which honored that ethic of how you build institutions called museums in a city like Los Angeles, if you wanted it to succeed.
Well, to some extent, still and maybe always, Los Angeles is the enormous place that you first encountered taking the train in from San Bernardino to Union Station.
Right.
Where would you put such an institution in the vast expanse of LA that would make it feel as if it belonged to the whole place?
Well, I think that you'd look at it, I think, in two ways, if I were thinking that. I think it should be in LA, and I mean in the downtown part of LA.
Really?
Yeah. No, I would not, well, I don't want to offend any geographic sections of LA, but I would not, I think it should be in what we define as the center of the city. But I would also say, and you can take a page from what LACMA has done recently. If we had the size and the financial heft to do it, I think we do the same. And that's this notion that there should be, however you do it, dispersion. Now maybe that's not, maybe it can be physical if you have the financial assets to do that, so that it isn't just in downtown LA, but it is elsewhere too. Or I would say that at the very least, this would be a situation, given the vast expanse of LA, where you would want to not just rely on the physical. Don't think only in terms of how many people you can get within your four walls and where that should be, but think instead about taking advantage of technologies that give it the spread that it needs to go elsewhere in the city. That's if museums learned anything from the last 14 months and in having to turn on a dime to do things virtually rather than in person, that's part of it. And that's something we will not change to it. We will continue to do that. Of course, we will pivot to embrace the folks who come to the campus itself. But if you should think, especially in a place like LA, of wherever it is you put it, and I still would tilt toward downtown LA, wherever you put it, that it has ways of reaching beyond its physical location that are meaningful and manageable for the institution and the audiences you attend.
Let's just talk briefly, and I promise I'm not going to monopolize your morning much more than I already have. Let's talk about exhibits. Are there exhibits coming up at the Autry that will open after your tenure that you're looking forward to? Ones at the Autry over your tenure that you've been especially proud of, and if you were, what should the and exhibits that you always wanted to do and never could, and maybe could find their way into an eventual museum of Los Angeles?
Oh, that's we're not going to deal with that in the next few minutes, so I won't even try. So, but I would say, first of all, ones that I have particularly appreciated or am particularly proud of, and let me preface it all by saying that I think museums should live by other than only their exhibits. I know that's our medium, that's our genre, if you will, that people associate with museums. But programming is much more diverse than that now, and it should be. And really, if you're trying to engage publics, then you need to be able to diversify your programming accordingly too. And first of all, not just rely on exhibits, but even to the extent you do rely on exhibits, get other people in the room than the predictable ones that we love them coming too, of course, but expand the audiences. So exhibits that have had a wonderful impact for me. One is, and I can't take any credit for this because it happened really before I came in, but it didn't open until after I was here. And that is Art of the West, the core art exhibit, which I happened to go through just the other day. And even those who have seen it, come back and see it again. There's lots of new material in it, even though it's a core exhibit that is just, it blows your eyes out. Exhibits that I felt especially close to, one would have to be La Raza.
Yeah.
And that was just it was a stunning success, and it was a moving success. I remember going into it the first weekend it opened to the public.
This is, just so people know, this is the exhibit of the great Chicano newspaper.
Yes, and movement, really, from 1967 to 1977, and political movement. And I often will go into an exhibit, not with a sack over my head, literally, but basically in disguise, just sort of walking around, seeing how people are responding, et cetera, et cetera. And what I found touching, almost to the point of making me teary-eyed, was it was fascinating. It was grandfathers and grandchildren. So La Raza definitely falls into that category, and was so touching. So it was the grandparents who had actually participated and knew La Raza because they lived through it. And of course, that's uniquely LA. La Raza was here, period. The movement may have been elsewhere, but it was really right here. And so it's important in that way. And so it was touching in that way to me. It just had impact on the community, and it reached as the first time at any opening reception, VIP reception, that I have seen a majority of audience that had brown faces rather than white faces. And so it was meaningful in that way too. And, that Saturday that I went in to just kind of talk to some people, see how they were doing. I was talking to one grandfather who had brought his granddaughter. They'd come 3 hours on a bus from South Los Angeles to get up there. So it was important. And so then what I would say is the other complexity is entirely external. And that has to do, by reference, literally and as metaphor, to the past 14 months, COVID, BLM. The fact is that there are externalities that museums have always kept as sort of externalities, if you will, that no longer can be that. We are not immune, nor should we be, from those kinds of considerations. So museums at this point are very much in the mode of figuring out how they deal with those complexities. And that has to do with two things. It has to do with how they operate internally, and looking at questions of equity, equitable treatment, inclusion, et cetera. And it has to do with the impact of those very same considerations on what their engaged in conversation with the public about. And so that's a complicated ball of wax. And again, it calls for rather a great deal of complexity on the part of the director.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you, as the director of the museums that you have directed, especially the Autry Museum, where, which was originally, I guess, jokingly referred to as the Museum of Cowboys and Indians, in reconciling those two halves, the cowboys and the Indians, the people who, felt very invested in one or the other, you may have had a certain early harbinger of some related issues that other museums got around to coping with later. How did you go about that?
Well, I think that's probably true. What I will say is that at the time I was trying to cope with that, lots of people were beginning to try to cope with that, because there was a crystallization, if you will, of some of those kinds of issues that appeared in the past 14 months or so. But it's been going on for the better part of a generation in terms of how museums deal with that. And I always considered that literalism of cowboys versus Indians as almost less substantive than it was metaphorical. In other words, a museum that purports to be intercultural and is talking about getting at the interstices, which are often the most interesting areas of American history, because that's where the untold stories or the more difficult stories lie for the most part. That's the complexity of it all. And it's not just cowboys versus Indians. If you look at Los Angeles, it is white people, non-white people, Chicanos, Chicanas, Latinx, Native people, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans. You write it out. You can hardly try to write it out without missing somebody. There's immense complexity in cultural communities here in LA. And the Autry actually feels that it should do perhaps a better job of getting beyond the literalism and even the metaphor of cowboys versus Indians. We need to encompass, in some respects, the entirety of the cultural milieu of Los Angeles.
That's interesting, as if almost the Autry, as goes the Autry Museum, so goes the city. If you can get that balance right and bring in, constituents, from all of them, then it shows you're going about it the right way. Were there instances or examples over the years that you found reassuring, that helped you believe that attempts to reconcile, and we talked about the La Raza exhibit, specific instances where you felt as if you were making headway in somehow building bridges between the late middle-aged guys with the big belt buckles who would come to the Autry, and the descendants of Native peoples who might have been actively interested and at the same time rather wary.
I think yes, you've picked the most obvious example, but it's not the only one. But just to focus on La Raza for a moment, that was definitely a huge step, I think, in that way, and an obvious one. It's not that it had never happened in some part before, but it happened most profoundly with La Raza, which was both a local event, if you will. La Raza, as we said yesterday, was LA. It may have been a symbol of the kind of movements that took place elsewhere, but that movement took place here and only here from 1967 to 1977. So that was a huge opening in that regard, and it went profoundly beyond even wonderful program that we've done, Sizzling Summer Nights, which is out on the plaza during the summer, and is salsa dancing and is wonderful. But there's something that gets at the guts of the Autry in complementing Sizzling Summer Nights with La Raza that's inside the museum. And a couple of other examples I think are really very important. Two of my favorite contemporary art exhibitions have been Harry Fonseca's exhibition, and that was quite a step forward.
For listeners who may not know that, just a quick thumbnail description of Harry's
He's
work.
a contemporary native artist, a Californian, whom, as I remember, introduced himself when he met me the first time, which was years and years ago, Unfortunately, he's not among us anymore. He died younger, quite honestly. But he said, hi, I'm Harry Fonseca. I'm Native, I'm Portuguese, I'm Hawaiian, and I'm white. Mm-hmm. And somehow his coupling and developing his own sensibilities about identity did encompass all of that. He was open to it all. But what that exhibit showed is not only what a prominent contemporary Native artist he was, and he's one of my favorites actually, but true to what I said yesterday, there's never much distance between Native artistic expression and life experience lived. In other words, they meet, and you see that in the art. And so that exhibit had much to do with not only revealing the personal side of Harry, which is what artists sometimes do, but also the communal side of Harry. In other words, it was his engagement as a Native person and a member of a Native collective with the rest of the world. And it was everything from talking about and spoofing at the American dream and what it did and didn't mean in Indian country, as well as the fact that at a later age, he came out as gay. And as a member of the gay community, probably from the late 80s on, something like that. It was a very important part of his experience. And it's even important as an experience vis-a-vis being at the same time a part of a Native community. And so it's that kind of cultural cross-rough, I think, that the Autry should try to get at and does get at quite beautifully many times, as far as I'm concerned.
And do you see examples of, interaction where, for example, at the opening of an exhibit, you've got the one natural constituency, original constituency of the Autry actually meeting and interacting with and getting to know the other natural constituency of the Autry?
Yes, and I will say that and even more profoundly, look even beyond the receptions for exhibitions. The fact is that our staff is far more that way now than it was when I arrived. We have Joe Horscapture, one of the most distinguished Native curators in the country, who sits as the vice president of Native collections. We have recruited others, brilliant younger curators who have come from elsewhere, and also are people of color who are now on our staff. So that's part of it. Yeah. And then I've got to give credit to the Board of Trustees itself. At the present time, the Board of Trustees, which has about 42 members or so, has between 5 and 10, probably about 7 or 8, who are either Native or Latinx. And so that's important too. And Dave Cartwright, the current chairman of the board, has embarked rather diligently, intentionally, and with very specific focus on diversifying the board too. So my point is, when you're transforming an institution, it is not just the audiences. It is the audiences, but you have to sort of do that from within, because that's when you guarantee that the audiences begin seeing themselves in the institution.
And each other.
Yes.
Wow. Well, just to bring it all back full circle, because we are Libros Schmibros, and I am actively, interested, to say the least, in reading. The reason, the pretext for this interview, not that it wouldn't have been delightful to talk to you on general principles, is that the LA Department of Cultural Affairs has been running a program that I helped midwife when I was there as director of literature, called The Big Read. It's administered by a great outfit called Arts Midwest. And the book we're reading is Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich.
I've read that too.
I dare say you have. Who is Ojibwe? What do you think of it?
I've read the entire trilogy.
Really? Really? So
it's linked with 2 others.
I know.
No, I think that that's very important, and I've known Louise Erdrich personally, as well as her late husband. For a long time, and it is storytelling that is also narrative. In other words, it is not only an insight into Native experience in life, but it is important in the reconstruction of a different narrative about Native people and their place in the American social fabric and cultural history. And so I was wondering, because you told me that was the case, but I didn't know what book it was. And that it's Love Medicine is comforting to me. And it's one that I read long ago, actually. But I think that that's important. And what I would say is this, that there are not only a number of fiction writers, although it's historical fiction, if you will. In other words, it is wonderfully interesting and engaging to read, but it is reflective of real times and real events and social movements and cultural dislocation and relocation and that kind of thing in history. But there's just an abundance. Louise was one of the very first, but you could probably tick off another half dozen or dozen with little effort who are currently moving into just wonderful fiction too. As well, I would say, and I'm sorry, the name is not on the end of my tongue at the moment, but my wife's book club has just finished a piece of nonfiction by a Native author, Potawatomi, named Kimmerer, Kimmerer, which is absolutely stunning, according to my wife, and is on my post-retirement book list, probably number one that I will be reading. So I look forward to that.
Well, let's hear it.
Your efforts at doing this too.
Oh, well, thanks. Certainly the LA Cultural Affairs Department is shouldering the lion's share. I just get to talk to interesting people for it. Let's see. And let's hear it for book clubs. I mean, in a way, the Big Read is a great big citywide book club. And also I belong to one run by Stephanie Pinsettle, who gave me the great idea of talking to you, the great environmental research at UCLA.
I know Stephanie very well.
Wonderful. If you'd had books like that as a kid, as opposed to, you know, the primarily, or in addition to the primarily oral storytelling that you talked about at the top, would your upbringing, do you think, have been different?
Oh, it would have been immensely helpful. That was a surround that we simply didn't have, that it didn't exist. And really what you did have, it's not that you didn't have fiction, but it now sits in book collections because it's sort of irrelevant to the present. And we've moved on from that. But no, there's an explosion of Native author-driven fiction and nonfiction that is terribly important now. And it's reflective really of what's happening with your book club and what you're trying to do and what the Autry is trying to do. You can see it springing up in any number of different areas where this effort to connect more directly with Native viewpoint, whether it's in the form of dazzling fiction or presentations at the Autry and exhibits or programs that speak a first-person voice. In other words, it's reflective of experience that is grounded in the Native community, not about them, but of them. And that's different. That's a very different kind of tale to tell.
Yeah, you never quite got that from Louis L'Amour, did you?
No, in fact, I'm not quite sure we even began to. It was just different, and I don't belittle those efforts, but it was a view from outside, and that's why I think it is so important to invoke first-person voice wherever we are, whether it's in the nonfiction telling of history, exhibits in museums, programs in museums, books that you're suggesting be read on a citywide basis in Los Angeles. It's all the same. It's under the same umbrella, as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. Well, you have intermittently begun to convince me that you are, in fact, going to, for lack of a better word, retire at least from museum management. Yes. You've already got your reading list, which is, of course, Exhibit A. What else do you hope to achieve? This will be the final question. What else are you hoping to squeeze in?
Sure.
retirement?
Well, what I've tried to do is I do believe in the concept of institution building, and that shows up in my career as a director. In particular, it came to me even when I was practicing law actively rather than running a museum. But let's stick with museums for a moment, and that is that I really believe that in concept and theory, museums can be influencers. Okay, especially when it comes to Native people, because so much of our stuff sits in them right now, and so. I've always wanted to be in a position, that is my contribution. I will tell you that my good friend, the late director of the National Museum of American History, Roger Kennedy, who was a mentor of mine even before I became a museum director and a distinguished author himself, once said, well, why don't you, I want you to write more. I want to see, well, I spoke a lot, and some of that indeed was published. But what I focused on was I want to be involved, if I can, in constructing and helping to put together institutions that outlast me for a long time, that contribute to this kind of reformation and transformation of natives and the place of natives in American society. And the fact is, the National Museum of the American Indian will be sitting there long after I'm gone, and even probably after you're gone. And it is an institution that I hope will continue to live. So that's what I focused on. And what I will do somewhat in retirement is, on a very carefully selected basis, and I think I indicated yesterday, subject to my wife's black ball, associated myself with a number of boards that I'm going on to in retirement, where it deals with museums, Native issues, environmental issues. And there, again, I'm kind of focused on what those organizations, which are all philanthropic or academic in one way or another, how they influence public society and how they contribute to the strengthening of institutions that at least I think you and I would like to see become stronger in American society.
You could always influence society by writing a book.
Well, and I haven't ruled that out. People keep talking to me about memoirs, but to me that seems personally slightly presumptuous at this point. So I'll figure that out. But I do love to write. There's no question, and I did it for a living as a lawyer, obviously, because I was an appellate litigator and I wrote all the time. But I'd like to write something else too.
Well, I look forward to your visits to Libros as soon as possible, and ultimately perhaps to bring us a book of your own to shelve.
Okay.
We've been talking with Rick West, the founding head of the National Museum of the American Indian on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and more recently, the head of the Autry Museum, and imminently any number of things, because his talents are limitless. Thank you very much, Mr. West, for bearing with us and sharing so much of your experience. And it feels presumptuous of me to say good luck, but I rely upon you to attract only the best of luck, as you've done so far.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed spending the time with you, and best wishes on your very important and worthy efforts here in Los Angeles.
Well, thank you very much.
Help out any way I can. So take care.
You bet. You bet. Come see us soon, and we'll try our best to live up to that. So long, Mr. West.
All right. Bye-bye.
So ends another episode of Libros Schmibros, recorded at the bilingual nonprofit Libros Schmibros Lending Library in Boyle Heights. By all means, follow us online in all the old familiar places, or email us via info@libroschmibros.org. By the way, we couldn't do this podcast without the whole Libros team, Cuauhtemoc, Colleen, Diana, and Alberto. And all of them would kill me if I didn't add this. Please consider visiting libroschmibros.org, hitting the donut button, the donate button, and giving us a gift. We put good free books into people's hands 5 days a week here at Libros, right across from Mariachi Plaza, up in the old Boyle Hotel. I'm David Kipen, and there'll always be a free book for you and thousands more to borrow here at Libros Schmibros.